Good morning, and happy Earth Sunday. I must admit I'm a little anxious about giving a sermon on the topic of faith and the environment. Anxious in part because I know this is a topic that is controversial and gets into the realm of science and politics. Anxious also because I know this is a topic that we have been hearing about literally for decades. What can I possibly say that is new about this topic? What could I say that might change our hearts and spur us on to greater action? I don't know the answer to these questions, so what I would like to do is offer a personal statement about my understanding of environmental issues and how my faith shapes my response to these questions. You could be forgiven for tuning out the news about climate change these days. Environmentalists have been sounding the alarm for decades. The first Earth Day took place in 1970. The steady drumbeat of news linking climate change to every new development, whether it be a storm, a drought, or extinction of a species, it deadens our senses. Moreover, the issue seems so big and the impact so far off that we don't really know where to start. So naturally, we tune it out and go on with our lives. And yet, I believe that climate change is the greatest issue that we face today. It is one that we as Christians can and must come to terms with. When we talk about specific actions or policies, then climate change becomes a political issue. But it's also an ethical and a spiritual one. It's an issue that strikes to the core of our role in God's creation. And it speaks to our compassion for those least responsible for and most affected by climate change. First, let me set the stage by giving a brief summary of what I understand climate change to be, what caused it, and what we need to do about it. You could call this an elevator speech, courtesy mostly of the environmentalist Bill McKibben. Human civilization has been around for thousands of years. Over that period, the climate and the temperature were very stable. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere fluctuated around 270 parts per million. 200 years ago, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, in what some refer to as the Great Experiment, we started digging up millions of years of stored carbon in the form of coal, oil, and gas, burning it and putting it into the atmosphere. Since then, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere has increased steadily. One organization, 350.org, which was co-founded coincidentally by Jeremy Osborne, son of our own Steve and Tina. This organization is based on the scientific consensus that life on Earth is not sustainable above 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Today, we are at 400 and climbing. The impact of this rise in atmospheric carbon and other greenhouse gases is wide-ranging and includes things like global warming. So far, we've experienced 1 degree Celsius of warming, and the impacts are clear, including a decline in Arctic sea ice, disappearing glaciers, disappearing ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland. Second, sea levels have begun to rise, and scientists warn that they could go up as much as several meters this century. If that happens, many of the world's cities, island nations, and farmland will be underwater. And finally, we are witnessing changes in climate patterns, notably more extreme events such as storms, droughts, and flooding. While the evidence of climate change is here and now, and the trend is clear, the real risk is of a sudden, catastrophic, irreversible change to our planet. There is overwhelming scientific consensus that climate change is happening, that it is caused by humans, and that it poses grave risks to the planet. But part of what makes this subject so controversial is that while there is consensus, there is not unanimity. There are those who would wait for further verification. But former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson draws a parallel between the recent financial crisis and climate change. He writes, "Viewing climate change in terms of risk assessment and risk management makes clear to me that taking a cautiously conservative stance, that is, waiting for more information before acting, is actually taking a very radical risk. We'll never know enough to resolve all the uncertainties, but we know enough to recognize that we must act now. The solution is conceptually very simple: stop burning carbon. But because our industry, our economy, our entire society are built on carbon, this is very difficult to achieve. It will, of course, require entirely retooling our means of energy production away from fossil fuels to clean sources. The implications are wide-ranging, and there are, of course, many vested interests involved. So that's a vastly oversimplified summary of climate change. The question is, how do we respond to this information? In what context do we place this story? And where do we place ourselves in the narrative? To answer some of these questions, let's turn to Scripture. Who among us has not shared the sentiment expressed in today's reading, Psalm 8, when we look up at the stars on a clear night? When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? We've all done this, right? Gazed up at the stars, pondered its vastness beyond our comprehension, wondered about the possibility of other galaxies and other intelligent life. And we usually come away from these encounters feeling very small and insignificant. And yet, Psalm 8 takes a surprising turn here. Even in the face of the glory of the heavens arrayed before him, the psalmist answers the question, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? He answers that with a striking affirmation of our role in creation. Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. So we're not small and insignificant. We are crowned with glory and honor, and we have dominion over the works of God's hands. But how should we understand this role? Are the animals and plants given to us to use as we see fit? Do we own them? Does our care or lack of care for creation have any spiritual significance? Well, lest we go too far and consider our roles too exalted, we are reminded that we don't own any of this, but are called to care for what is and remains God's creation. Scripture is clear that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, from Psalm 24. Or from Deuteronomy 10, to the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth and everything in it. Thomas Aquinas describes our role as natural dominion, whereas God maintains absolute dominion. And there are limits to how we are to exercise this dominion. Scripture is filled with images and imperatives regarding the balance of nature which we are not to disturb. We are instructed, for example, to manage our harvests in a way that leaves some for the poor. Leviticus 19, in beautiful imagery, instructs us, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. To me, this is an image worth keeping in mind as we consider the impact that our actions have on those less fortunate. Finally, we are called to see creation not merely as a collection of plants and animals we need to manage, but as something sacred. We're told that creation sings out to God, it praises him. Psalm 19 says, the heavens declare the glory of God. Or from 1 Chronicles, let the sea resound and all that is in it, let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Then the trees of the forest will sing, they will sing for joy before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. If we truly believe this, then our care for creation is not an act of animal husbandry or agriculture, but an act of worship. Even mundane, small acts that we take to preserve the environment become sacred acts. To summarize, when I turn to Scripture for guidance on the environment, I see a few lessons. First, we're given an exalted role with responsibility to care for the plants and animals. Second, we don't own any of it, but we are called to act as stewards. Third, we are called to manage it in a manner that cares for the least fortunate among us. And finally, creation is sacred, and our caring for it is an act of worship. But what does any of this mean for us today? What does it mean for us as individuals? And as a church, how should we respond to these questions? Before stating my own beliefs, let me review what a few religions and religious leaders have had to say. Our own denomination, the United Church of Christ, has been active and vocal on environmental issues. The most definitive statement from the UCC came in the 2007 Resolution on Climate Change, and it states, "Whereas the impact of global warming as currently predicted and understood by leading scientists and scientific bodies around the world will dramatically and negatively alter God's gracious gift of creation. Whereas experts speak with a profound sense of urgency and clearly state that the window of opportunity to avoid catastrophic climate change is rapidly diminishing. Whereas the predicted impact of global warming will have a disproportionate impact of those living in poverty, least developed countries, the elderly, and children, and those least responsible for the emissions of greenhouse gases. Therefore, be it resolved that the 26th General Synod of the United Church of Christ admits Christian complicity in the damage human beings have caused to the Earth's climate system and other planetary life systems, and urges recommitment to the Christian vocation of responsible stewardship of God's creation, and expresses profound concern for the pending environmental, economic, and social tragedies threatened by global warming to creation, human communities, and traditional sacred spaces." Pope Francis has also been forceful in his statements on how we should treat God's creation, saying things like, "Let us be renewed by God's mercy. Let us become agents of this mercy, channels through which God can water the earth, protect all creation, and make justice and peace flourish." He continues, "The book of Genesis tells us that God created man and woman, entrusting them with the task of filling the earth and subduing it, which does not mean exploiting it, but nurturing and protecting it, caring for it through their work." Also from Pope Francis, "This task entrusted to us by God the Creator requires us to grasp the rhythm and logic of creation. But we are often driven by pride of domination, of possessions, manipulation, of exploitation. We do not care for it, we do not respect it, we do not consider it as a free gift that we must care for." In June of this year, Pope Francis will issue a rare papal encyclical on climate change, and he will speak to our Congress. Catherine Jefferts Schori, Bishop of the U.S. Episcopal Church, sees climate change as similar to the struggle for civil rights. In her words, "It is in that sense much like the civil rights movement in this country, where we are attending to the rights of all people and the rights of the earth to continue to be a flourishing place. It is certainly a moral issue in terms of the impacts on the poorest and most vulnerable around the world today." Finally, Jim Wallace, founder of Sojourners, writes, "Here's the moral narrative. What will your grandchildren's grandchildren ask about why we and why you did not do what was necessary for them? Why were we so selfish and short-sighted? Why didn't we care enough about the future of our world and theirs to take care of our descendants? And here's the biblical and spiritual narrative. Does God care for God's creation really allow us to exploit the earth and its resources for short-term economic self-interest? Is that good stewardship and the humble worship of God? These are just a few voices of religious leaders about climate change. As you can imagine, we could fill pages and several sermons with more examples. Let me close then with a personal statement about what I believe. As a layperson, I trust the overwhelming scientific consensus that humans are causing changes to our climate that hold grave risks to our planet. As a Christian, I believe we have been given a sacred role to care for God's creation, and it causes me great sadness to see how we are failing in this role. This failure is not just an economic or a scientific one, it is a spiritual one. We are not just causing mass animal extinctions and threatening our planet, we are failing to live out the role and purpose that we were given. Moreover, I fear that our actions will have the greatest impact on those who are the least responsible and most vulnerable. As the UCC resolution states, I admit my Christian complicity. This is not a problem caused by those oil companies or those politicians. I am part of the problem. My tolerance for, my acquiescence to, indeed my zeal for the wasteful, extractive, consumptive lifestyle that we lead places me squarely in the middle of the problem. And these problems are so entrenched and the time scales so long that it is difficult for us to know what to do and difficult to sustain our devotion to the cause. And yet we are called as individuals and as a church to speak and act prophetically in defense of creation. One thought that I've had repeatedly in preparing this reflection is that perhaps we as a church can begin to explore the idea of environmental ministries, exploring and living out the role we can play both as individuals and as a church. We might educate and encourage one another on environmental issues, take practical steps together, and perhaps advocate for policies that shift us away from a carbon-based economy. By so doing, we will be committing sacred acts, even seemingly mundane ones such as changing light bulbs, composting, replacing appliances, or writing letters to policymakers, are ways of living out our faith and exercising our role here, today, in Simsbury as stewards of creation. I'd like to close with an image of the subway that for me has come to represent the challenge of seeing ourselves in the narrative of climate change. If you've ridden the subway, you've probably seen this situation. The doors open, people hasten out of the car and then rush to get in the car. People in the middle of the car are distracted by their books and their smartphones. People at the door are scrambling to squeeze together so as not to get crushed by the closing doors. As you look around, you see there's actually plenty of room in the middle of the car, but people in the middle didn't notice the crowd at the door or didn't feel any need to make room. I see it again and again. I feel like we're in the middle of the car, living our lives oblivious to the struggle going on at the door. The people at the door are the poor, the elderly, and the children who will suffer the impact of climate change first. They are our children and grandchildren asking us why we didn't do something when we still could. I pray that we can find a way to make room for us all. Amen.